They gave me a title and a cabin, and not much else. Civilian Diplomatic Liaison, Third Attaché. That was the designation on the lanyard they handed me at Callisto Station before we boarded the Corval Haas. Nobody explained what a third attaché was supposed to do during an actual first contact ceremony, because nobody had done one before. The job, as far as I could piece together from the pre-mission briefing documents, most of which were classification locked above my clearance level and showed up as gray bars on my display, was to observe, to record personal impressions in a daily log, and to stay out of the way of the people who actually knew what they were doing. I was 34 years old. I had spent the previous 6 years working cultural translation contracts for the compact, mostly mid-level diplomatic postings at the orbital stations near the Karev boundary. I spoke passable Veth-form Kaudi, the simplified trade register dialect, the caste-based Kaudi consolidation, used for dealing with species they hadn't fully assessed yet. I had met Kaudi administrators before at those boundary stations, across cold rooms and colder negotiating tables, in the particular atmosphere of professional distance that the Kaudi maintained with every species they hadn't formally classified. I had shaken the equivalent of their hands. A lateral wrist press, brief, no grip, both parties leaning slightly back rather than slightly in. I had negotiated cargo transit schedules and port access fee structures, and the minor, grinding tedium of interstellar import tariff codes. That kind of diplomacy was 90% paperwork and 10% sitting in a room pretending the ambient temperature didn't bother you. The Kaudi kept their ships very cold by human standards. I never asked why, and nobody volunteered it. What I had not done in 6 years of that work was witness a formal first contact protocol. The Kaudi consolidation had been aware of humanity for about 11 years at that point, aware, and at various degrees of cool remove. We had not been formally received. We had not been invited into any ceremony of acknowledgement. We had existed, in their records and their assessments, as what their Cultural Analysis Division apparently called a mid-tier biological species of localized relevance, capable of interstellar travel, demonstrably tool-using, not immediately threatening, and possessed of what those assessors apparently described in their internal documents as a structural naivety regarding hierarchical station. I found that last phrase in a translated intercept summary that someone had accidentally left unlocked in the shared briefing folder on the Corval Haas's mission drive. I read it twice, then closed it, and did not tell anyone I had seen it. I thought about it for most of the transit from Callisto to the Harev Deep. Structural naivety, it stayed with me. Not because it stung, it was accurate enough if you accepted the Kaudi framework, which I didn't entirely, but because of what it implied about the assumptions they were bringing into the ceremony. They had been dealing with us for 11 years at the trade register level, through the boundary stations, at the bottom of their formal hierarchy, and in all that time they had read us as a species that didn't fully grasp our own position in the order of things. A species that talked and traded and moved around, but hadn't internalized, or perhaps couldn't, the kind of deep structural self-knowledge that the Kaudi considered the baseline for serious engagement. I understood, standing in that corridor with the gray-barred briefing files on my display, that this ceremony was going to be, in part, about revising that read. I didn't know how, not yet. The Harev Deep was not on any civilian navigation chart I had ever seen. It was a slow region of space about 40 light hours from the nearest cataloged system, far enough from any star that the void around you felt genuinely absolute. No ambient glow from a sun, no planet shine, nothing to give you spatial orientation except the navigational beacons the two parties had agreed to deploy before the meeting. When you looked out a viewport in the Harev, you saw stars, but they were the old distant kind, the kind so far removed from you that their light carries no warmth and serves no navigational purpose. They just confirm that space is large. They're witnesses, not guides. You look at them and understand, in a way you don't when you're near a system with a working sun, exactly how much of what exists is darkness and cold and distance, and how little of it has anything to do with you. I boarded the Corval Haas 11 days before the ceremony date. The ship was a diplomatic frigate, compact flagged, her full designation the CNS Corval Haas out of the IO anchorage. She was not a warship. She had not been built to look like one, and she had been deliberately dressed to make that unworshipness as visible as possible. Mid-size vessel, about 300 meters stem to stern, with lines that were understated to the point of deliberateness. A gentle forward taper, no visible weapon emplacements on the primary hull, sensor arrays tucked into housings that didn't project or threaten, hull plating in the compact standard ivory-gray diplomatic livery, with the tree-end circle crest of the diplomatic service painted large on both flanks. They had repainted her specifically for this mission. I could see the seams of the new paint near the forward sensor cluster, where it had been applied over older markings, something utilitarian and registry standard that had been painted over with something softer and more considered. Someone had spent real time making this ship look like it was not a threat. Ambassador Lenta Koval was the mission lead. She was 61, short, with gray-streaked hair she kept in a tight braid, and the particular quality that the best diplomats acquire over long careers. A stillness that was not passivity. There is a kind of stillness that comes from not caring very much, and there is a kind of stillness that comes from caring very precisely about very specific things, and having learned to show nothing about anything else. Koval had the second kind. She moved through the ship's corridors at a deliberate pace and spoke to crew and staff by name, and seemed to register everything in her vicinity without appearing to study it. In 11 days of transit, I watched her run 3 separate all-hands briefings, 2 formal preparation sessions with the senior diplomatic staff, and 1 very quiet 20-minute conversation with Commander Selk Orant in the communications suite that I happened to see the beginning of before the door closed. She and Orant did not look like 2 people having the same kind of conversation. We had 1 substantive talk in those 11 days. She had called me to her working cabin, a tidy space dominated by a large display wall and a folding table covered in actual paper documents, which told you something about how she processed difficult problems, and offered me tea, and said, "You're here because you've been in rooms with Caudi administrators before, and you didn't embarrass yourself or us. That's the full extent of why you're here. When we're in the ceremony chamber, you will stand where you're placed, you will not speak unless directly addressed, and you will watch everything. Afterward, I want your impressions, not analysis. Impressions. What did it feel like? What did you see in the room? A person standing there, not a specialist. Can you do that?" I said yes. She nodded and went back to her documents. I understood, walking back down the corridor to my cabin, that she had not asked me whether I was honored to be here or whether I understood the gravity of the occasion or any of the performative things that people in those situations often said to participants who were not expected to contribute much. She had asked me 1 operational question and received 1 operational answer, and that was the conversation. I found that reassuring. It meant she had a use for me that was specific, and that the use was real, and that I would know when I was doing it. The Caudi protocol teams arrived 3 days before the ceremony. They came in a pair of shuttle-class vessels, small and angular in the way Caudi ship design had always been, functional profiles that looked like they'd been built by engineers who had no patience for aesthetic choices that didn't serve an operational purpose. The characteristic blade fin cooling arrays along the hull flanks gave their ships a spined silhouette, like something that had evolved to shed heat rather than retain it, which in a way was exactly what they were. The Caudi ran hot internally, metabolically, and their ships ran cold by design. The external cooling architecture was the engineering answer to that problem, and it was visible in every ship class they had ever built. The shuttles docked at the Corval Haas's secondary bay, which had been cleared of its normal equipment and reconfigured to accommodate Cawdy atmospheric preferences. Cooler by 8 degrees from the human standard sections. Drier. Lower ambient light shifted toward the blue end of the spectrum, which was where Cawdy visual acuity was strongest. The modifications had been made 3 weeks in advance, and you could smell the difference when the bay door opened. That particular quality of cold, dry air that I associated with every Cawdy facility I had been in, something between an empty hangar and a walk-in freezer. I watched the docking from the observation corridor above the bay. 12 of them in the advance party, protocol and administrative staff, not the principals. The Cawdy came in castes, and the first thing you learned about dealing with them was that caste was not a social category. It was a cognitive architecture. 11,000 years of it. A Cawdy from one caste tier was not merely discouraged from addressing a Cawdy from a caste more than 2 steps removed without an intermediary. They were not structured to do it. The intermediary protocols were not etiquette. They were the result of an internal organizational logic that had been refined over so long that it had become partly physiological. The higher castes and the lower castes within the Cawdy system did not think about the world the same way. They were not supposed to. The advance party was all Vekari Mid, the administrative tier that handled external affairs with species the consolidation hadn't formally classified. We were still unclassified. That was precisely what made this ceremony necessary, and this particular tier responsible for it. The Vekari Mid were the Cawdy's working face with the outside galaxy, and they were very good at their jobs in the way that people are good at jobs that have been refined by 11,000 years of repetition. They came off the shuttles moving with the fluid precision I remembered from the boundary stations, taller than humans by a head and a half, long laterally jointed arms, skin ranging from pale lavender through deep slate gray, depending on their caste level and thermal state. In the cold of the adapted bay, they were the color of old iron, darkening from whatever they'd been in the warmer shuttle environment. The skin color wasn't camouflage or display. It was thermoregulation, melanin analog in their integument, responding to ambient temperature the way a chameleon responds to light, but purely metabolically. I had learned this early in my boundary station posting, from a xenobiologist's briefing note, and it was one of those facts that sounds simple and takes a long time to actually absorb. The color of a Cawdy wasn't decoration. It was data. They did not look at me on the observation corridor. They did not acknowledge anyone who was not part of the formal reception line. This was not rudeness. It was protocol. The Vekari Mid dealt with formal appointments, not incidental encounters in corridors, and anyone standing in an observation corridor above a docking bay was, by definition, not a formal appointment. Ambassador Koval met them at the bay entrance with 3 of her senior staff. There were wrist-press greetings, formal register Cawdy exchanged, an acknowledgement of the space and its modifications. One of the advance party, Sekarveth, I later learned his designation, a form that indicated both his tier within the Vekari Mid and his functional role in the advance team, produced a rolled document of some kind and presented it to Ambassador Koval. She received it with both hands and inclined her head. He inclined his. 20 minutes. Then the advance party was escorted to their adapted quarters. The corridor cleared, and I was left at the observation railing alone. I stayed there for a few minutes, looking at the closed bay door. What I had just watched was, in the formal sense, entirely routine, a docking and a greeting, nothing that hadn't been choreographed in advance and coordinated through multiple rounds of protocol exchange. But the room had felt a certain way while it was happening. The way a very old mechanism feels when it runs. The precision of something engineered over a very long span of time to do exactly this thing, and doing it exactly. I wrote down, the room felt like the inside of a clock. I knew even as I wrote it that it was inadequate, but it was the closest thing I had. The ceremony platform, the Hair Deep Neutral Station module, was a prepositioned structure the Compact had deployed, and the Qaadi had inspected via their own probe drones 3 weeks prior. It was modest, about the size of a large house, hexagonal in cross-section, with a central exchange chamber, 2 preparation wings that separated on atmospheric lines, environmental control sufficient for both parties' requirements, and sensor shielding robust enough that neither side's military assets, and both sides had them, deployed at agreed distances, could acquire a targeting lock on the principals during the exchange. The shielding was required by the protocol agreement, signed by both parties 3 months before the ceremony date. The Qaadi had insisted on it. The compact had agreed without hesitation. When both parties to a first contact ceremony have military assets standing off in the dark, the ability to verify that no one is targeting the room is not a luxury. I knew we had escort assets in the area. The accessible sections of the briefing documents mentioned a standard diplomatic escort configuration, 2 compact patrol vessels holding at 40,000 kilometers, authorized to close to defensive distance only if the ceremony was disrupted by external action. Standard protocol for this class of event. The Qaadi would know they were there. We would know the Qaadi had their own equivalents. Everyone knew everyone had assets. It was not a secret, and the fact that it was not a secret was part of the point. Both parties had agreed to a structure and both parties were visibly inside it, and that visibility was itself a form of trust building. We know you're armed. You know we're armed. We're both standing in this room anyway. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, because nothing in any document I had been given access to mentioned it, and because the people who knew were not telling me, and because I was the third attaché and not the ambassador or the naval liaison commander, was what else was sitting in the hair deep with us. I thought about this later, the specific choice to not brief me. I considered the possibility that it was simply security compartmentalization, that the asset's existence was classified above my clearance, and the omission was automatic, not a considered decision about me specifically. But I kept coming back to what Koval had said. I want your impressions, not your analysis. A person standing in the room. And I understood eventually that the 2 things were connected. You cannot give clean impressions of a surprise you've been told about. The value of the impression depended on the surprise being real. She had preserved the surprise. That meant she had thought about it. I was an instrument, and she had kept me uncalibrated on purpose, because uncalibrated instruments read true. The ceremony chamber was hexagonal, about 15 meters across, with a low curved ceiling and lighting set to a compromised spectrum, slightly warm on the human side, slightly cool on the Qaadi side, neutral down the center where the principals would stand. The floor was the same non-reflective composite throughout, a pale gray that absorbed the light without giving anything back. There were no chairs. The Qaadi did not use seating in formal contexts, and so the entire ceremony was conducted standing, which I had been warned about in the pre-ceremony brief, and which turned out to be harder than it sounded after the first 2 hours. My feet hurt for 2 days afterward. Ambassador Koval's party was 7. Herself 2 senior attachés, Ren Makalu handling live translation, and 3 observers. The other 2 observers were Dr. Peel Vorsen, a cultural specialist whose published work on caste system dynamics was apparently considered the authoritative human scholarship on the subject, and who carried himself with the slightly distracted intensity of a person who has been waiting their entire professional career for the specific situation they are now standing in, and Commander Selk Orant, whose rank insignia were unfamiliar to me, and whose bearing communicated, without ambiguity, that she was not present for cultural enrichment. I was placed at the back of the human section, near the wall, behind Vorsen and Orant. That was fine. I could see everything. The back of the room was exactly where a person whose function was to watch should stand. The Qaadi principal was High Administrator Drevath Kaul, a designation that indicated the senior tier of the Vekari Mid that handled external first classifications. In Qaadi hierarchy, Drevath Kaul was not at the top. The consolidation's actual governing caste, the Savitora, the ancient lineage tier that held political and symbolic power, did not deal with external species directly. That was categorically not their function, and the classification system was specific about the fact that contact with unclassified species was below the threshold of Savitora involvement. Drevath Kal was the highest caste that engaged with the outside world, and for us, engaging with Drevath Kal was the ceiling available to us at this stage. Dr. Vorson had explained this before the ceremony with the flat tone of someone describing a bureaucratic procedure, which was in some ways what it was, and which helped me not add more interpretive weight to the limitation than it actually carried. Drevath Kal arrived with 11. Vekari High and Vekari Peak, the upper tiers of the administrative caste, darker in coloring than the advance party, more deliberate in movement, carrying themselves with a quality I kept trying to name and kept ending up at the same word: precision, not rigidity. Precision is not the same as rigidity. Rigidity implies strain, effort applied to maintain form against resistance. These people showed no strain whatsoever. They moved into the chamber and took their positions with the ease of people executing a motion they had rehearsed until it was no longer rehearsal, but simply what they did, and what it communicated was not the arrogance of performance, but the calm of a functioning system. Things that work correctly over a long time develop that quality. It is disconcerting if you're watching for pride or threat. It is simply accurate if you're watching for information. Drevath Kal was the tallest of them and the darkest, deep slate, almost charcoal, the coloring of high metabolic focus that I knew from my boundary station reading was something the Kadi called deep ready, the state of sustained alert attention. He had been in deep ready since he walked in. He was processing everything in the room and producing no external sign of it, which was itself a form of communication. He stood at the center of the Kadi section and regarded Ambassador Koval with the lateral assessment gaze, head turned roughly 45 degrees, the dominant side-facing eye brought fully to bear. It lasted 6 seconds. Then the gaze returned to forward and the ceremony began. I will not describe the full 3 hours and 12 minutes of the ceremony in detail, because most of it, while extraordinary in the formal and historical sense, was in the immediate experiential sense repetitive. Ritual always is. The repetition is structural. It creates a shared framework that both parties inhabit together, a form of proof by action that each party is present, willing, and inside the agreed structure. The ceremony was doing something important by being long and careful and identical in execution to the way it had been agreed it would be done. Both parties were demonstrating, through every exchanged phrase and formal response and precisely timed acknowledgement, that they were willing to inhabit the same structure. That willingness was itself the first deliverable of the event. The classification at the end was the second deliverable, and it could only carry weight if the first one had been established. Makalu translated in a continuous murmur in my earpiece. I followed the Veth form Kadi well enough to track the content without needing the translation for every phrase, which meant I was catching both what was said and the texture of how it was said, the rhythm and register, and the small variations in formality that the trade dialect couldn't always carry. Dr. Vorson, next to me, was doing something more sophisticated. I watched his stylus moving in small, precise gestures that I eventually realized were not note-taking but a private annotation system, logging protocol deviations and timing variations against an expected baseline. He was reading the ceremony the way you read a piece of music you know well, attending not just to the notes, but to the choices a performer makes about tempo and emphasis, the tiny departures from the template that carry information about the performer's state and intention. I watched his face as much as I watched the Kadi. His expression stayed professionally neutral. His eyes were very busy. Commander Orant, on my other side, attended to the Kadi retinue the way an inventory clerk attends to a shelf, noting positions, tracking movements, counting. Her attention had the quality of something being maintained against effort, which surprised me, because she had not seemed like a person who found anything difficult. I watched her scan the Caudy positions in a regular repeating pattern, like radar sweeps, and then shift her attention to the chamber's outer bulkhead and the viewport behind the human section, and then back to the Caudy. The circuit took about 40 seconds each time. She had been doing it since the ceremony started. I didn't understand what she was looking for, not then. The recess came midway through the second hour. A formal break, both parties withdrawing to their preparation wings for refreshment and private consultation. The human wing had coffee, flatbread, dried fruit from Earth that tasted like it had been packed 8 months ago, which it probably had, and a line of the Corval Haas's crew who had been waiting the entire ceremony duration in various states of tense readiness, and were now visibly relieved to have something practical to do. The ritual of service, handing cups, refilling water, checking atmospheric controls seemed to settle everyone, including me. I took a cup of coffee and stood at the preparation wing's outer viewport. It faced away from the neutral station module, out into the hair of deep proper, stars at their proper ancient distances, giving nothing back. The two compact patrol vessels were visible at the edge of long-range visual, tiny hard-edged lights in the dark, exactly where they were supposed to be, holding their agreed positions with the patience of ships that had been there for days and expected to be there for days more. I had watched them on the transit approach and during the approach phase before the ceremony, and they were always exactly where they were supposed to be, which should have been reassuring and mostly was, except that there was something about their precision that made me aware of how much precision was involved in all of this, how many decisions had been made, and how many positions had been calculated, and how many things were in exactly the places they were supposed to be. I drank my coffee. I looked at the deep. I thought, for no specific reason I could name, what else is out here? The break ended. We filed back into the chamber. The ceremony resumed. The third hour was the classification sequence, the section that mattered most in the formal sense. After hours of establishing the structure, both parties were now going to use it to produce something concrete, a provisional designation for humanity in the Caudy's hierarchical taxonomy of known species. Not a caste, because you couldn't assign caste to a non-Caudy species. A relational position. A defined placement in the grammar of how the consolidation would speak about us, think about us, engage with us across every subsequent interaction at every level of their administrative apparatus. First contact designations had weight that accrued over time. They became the assumption that informed the assumption. They were difficult to revise once set, because revision required acknowledging that the initial assessment had been wrong, and the Caudy administrative system did not accommodate the concept of wrong assessments gracefully. Dr. Vorson had briefed us on the classification tiers before the ceremony. The Caudy external species taxonomy had 7 recognized categories for non-Caudy civilizations, ranging from Sovhid adjacent, a peer designation assigned exactly twice in 11,000 years, down to Veth observed, a kind of permanent visitor status for species deemed technically capable but not structurally significant. The analysis consensus among the Compact's Caudy affairs specialists had been that we would receive Vekari external, third tier from the top, acknowledged and dealt with, structurally subordinate but not dismissed. Receiving Vekari external would have been considered a diplomatic success. We had, objectively, been a spacefaring species for less than a century and a half. We had been dealing with the Caudy specifically for 11 years. Vekari external was not unreasonable. Makalu was translating the preamble to the classification declaration. I was following, everything was proceeding, the structure was holding, and then Drevathkal paused. 2 seconds. In the middle of a formal phrase whose structure I knew well enough to know that pauses did not belong there. Not a breath, not a rhetorical beat. A stop, the kind that happens when something unexpected enters a calculation. Dr. Vorsen's stylus went completely still. Dreveth Call turned his head. Not the formal lateral turn of the dominant eye assessment. A different angle, both eyes forward, full face orientation. The confrontation register that in Cawdy body language was reserved for direct engagement with a specific subject. He was not looking at Ambassador Koval. He was not looking at the translation station or the senior attaches. He was looking past the human section, past all of us, toward the outer viewport behind our positions. The viewport that faced away from the neutral station module. The viewport that faced out into the hair of deep. I turned to look, everyone turned to look. There are moments when a room moves in a direction before the room understands why, and you move with it, and this was one of those moments. And when I looked through the viewport, I understood what Commander Oren had been scanning for in her 40-second circuits of the chamber. And I understood what Koval had meant when she said she wanted my impressions rather than my analysis. And I understood, with the specific chill that comes from comprehension rather than cold, exactly what had been out there the whole time. The Dreadnought was still finishing its approach. It had been in the hair of deep since before the ceremony began, since before the advance party arrived, since before the Corval Haas reached the ceremony site. 3 days, at minimum, by what I later calculated from the timeline. Sitting in the dark at a distance calibrated precisely against what the compact's intelligence arm knew about the Cawdy sensor package range and sensitivity, drawing so little power that its thermal signature was beneath the detection threshold of every sensor array the Cawdy had deployed for this event. Cold and silent and patient. Not hiding exactly. There is no hiding in deep space, not truly, because something is always emitting, but configured to emit less than the threshold of notice, positioned to be a fact that had not yet been presented. What Drevath Call's sensors had caught, in the last few minutes, was the beginning of the presentation. The Dreadnought was powering up. Not its weapons, not its drive. Its systems, the ordinary cycling of capacitors and secondary power mains and sensor arrays coming back to operational draw, the energy signature of a large ship choosing to wake up and become visible. It was the equivalent of a person standing in a dark corner choosing to step into the light. Not a threatening gesture, a declarative one. I am here. I have been here. Now you know. Through the viewport, I watched it come. It did not rush. That was the first thing. The pace of its approach was the pace of something with no operational reason to hurry, which is a different communicative register from the pace of something that is not capable of hurrying. It moved at the speed of deliberate intent, and deliberate intent at that size had its own kind of gravity. Running lights came up along the hull as it closed range warm amber along the upper spine, precise and sequential, and cold blue along the engine flanks, the kind of illumination that had functional purpose and simultaneously declared, "You see me because I am choosing to be seen." The lights came up in a pattern that was unmistakably systematic, not gradual, not uncertain. A sequence, a decision. Then the scale registered. There is a particular moment when the eye resolves something large and distant into something large and close, and the two experiences are not the same. I had been watching a shape resolve through the viewport, and at some distance it crossed a threshold and became something my mind could not process as a vessel in the way a vessel is processed, as a thing you might board or dock with or radio or otherwise relate to as a human artifact at a human scale. It became, instead, a geographic event, something you might navigate around, something whose presence changed the character of the space it occupied. A blocky hull, heavy and deliberate, not streamlined, not built to look fast, not built to look beautiful or minimal or elegant in any sense that prioritized appearance over function. Built to look like what it was. A platform designed to bring enormous destructive capability to a specific location and keep it there, for as long as required, against any opposition that attempted to move it. Several kilometers of armored plating, gun emplacements distributed across the hull in overlapping coverage patterns, Sensor arrays clustered at the command tower and along the spine, and at intervals along the flanks. Crew decks that were visible as grid-pattern viewport lighting behind armored blast shutters. Engine blocks that were simply too large to look like anything that belonged on a ship built for anything other than sustained long-range independent operations. The hull was dark, nearly black, but not uniformly, because the surface was not uniform. It was marked. Scarred in the way long-service ships accumulate marking. Scorch patterns in a range of colors depending on what had put them there. Repair plate overlaps where field maintenance had replaced damaged sections with whatever was available rather than what matched. Structural reinforcement bands bolted across sections of original hull plating. Sensor housings added and repositioned over service cycles. Antenna spires that had been replaced and were slightly different lengths from the originals. The ship was used. It had been in places and done things, and the hull recorded those facts in the language of accumulated damage and accumulated repair. It was not a ceremonial vessel. It was not a demonstration piece. It was a working instrument of a kind that only becomes that way through use. I later learned her class designation from Commander Orant, who mentioned it in the debrief with the brevity of someone stating a well-known fact. Recourse-class strategic Dreadnought, commissioned 14 years prior, 4 hulls in the class, the construction program classified from inception. The Caudi intelligence services had known the recourse program existed in a theoretical sense. The compact's industrial output and resource acquisition patterns implied a capital ship program of a certain scale, and Caudi's strategic analysis had modeled the probability and the rough capability envelope of what that program would produce. A number, an inference. Something you budget against in your threat models. Not a thing with amber running lights and 14 years of hull markings, and 4 kilometers of darkness at your viewport. I watched Dreadnought call. He had turned back toward the center of the chamber, away from the viewport, in the seconds between the ship becoming visible and the ship completing its approach to holding position. By the time the Dreadnought came to rest at 300 kilometers from the neutral module, close enough to fill every outward-facing viewport, far enough to correspond to no offensive tactical configuration, Dreadnought Call was standing where he had been standing, facing forward, hands at the formal rest position of the Vekari High Register. His retinue had not moved. I had expected physiological tells. A flinch, a step back, an instinctive shift of weight, a change in the tight clustering of the retinue. Any of the things that happen when a living being's nervous system receives a sudden input that its working model hadn't priced in. None of that happened. The Caudi administrative apparatus did not process surprise in that register. What had happened instead was subtler and, I thought, more significant. The quality of the stillness had changed. Before the Dreadnought's lights came on, the stillness in the Caudi section had been the stillness of a functioning system executing a known procedure. The stillness between cycles of a mechanism that has run this sequence before and expects to run it again. Comfortable stillness. The stillness of certainty. After the lights came on, the stillness was different in a way I struggled to articulate then and still struggle to articulate now, except to say, it had density. Weight. The stillness of a system receiving an input that required significant processing before it could produce a useful output. Not panic. Panic would have been visible. Not fear. The Caudi metabolic response to fear darkened the skin further, and I was watching the coloring and it had not changed. Something more like the internal experience of a very large calculation beginning. You cannot hear a calculation beginning, but you can sometimes feel the room change when it does. The Dreadnought held position. It had not signaled. It had not transmitted on any of the agreed communication frequencies. It had not maneuvered toward the station module, or toward the Caudi escort vessels holding at their agreed distance, or toward any object in the vicinity that would have given its positioning a hostile interpretation. It simply came to position and stopped, which in the vocabulary of deep space operations means, I am here. This is my location. I am not moving. Dreveth Call said something in Kaudi. Makalu translated it into my earpiece with the flat precision of a good translator who has been trained to carry meaning without carrying interpretation. You built this. It was not a question. There was no interrogative structure in it. It was a statement produced in the form of an address, which in formal Kaudi register meant, I am revising a belief I held with confidence, and I am doing so in your presence, and I am acknowledging that the revision was caused by you. Ambassador Koval said, we build what we need. 4 words. Makalu translated them. The silence that followed lasted 40 seconds, which is a very long time in a formal ceremony chamber between 2 delegations who had been filling every pause with protocol. I watched Dreveth Call absorb it. The absorption was visible if you knew how to watch for it. Not in any single motion, he did not move in the 40 seconds. But there was a process happening in him that I could track in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his forward gaze and the precise, measured intervals between the small adjustments that very still people make when they have been standing in one position for a long time. He was receiving a fact. The fact was large. He was letting it enter his model, and the process of letting it enter was not violent and was not graceful and was not quick. It was deliberate. The way you set a heavy thing down slowly, because setting it down fast would break something. Then he looked at the viewport again. He looked at the Dreadnought for approximately 10 seconds. Then he looked at Ambassador Koval. He said, the classification sequence must be suspended. I had time to register Dr. Vorsen's sharp, nearly inaudible intake of breath before Makalu finished translating, and then I had time to register what Makalu had just said. And then I had time to understand that the pre-mission analysis consensus, the 17 papers on caste system dynamics, the 3 months of protocol preparation, and the weeks of briefing materials, and the careful calibrated understated diplomatic frigate, painted ivory gray with the tree-encircled crest. All of it had been operating toward a different outcome than this, and this outcome was larger. Ambassador Koval said, we understand. There was a further exchange, formal and careful, invoking the protocol clauses that provided for temporary suspension and agreed on a timeline for resumption. 11 days. Both parties would withdraw to their respective vessels and consult. The ceremony would resume from the suspension point. 11 days of consultation. That was the magnitude of what the Dreadnought represented. Not hours, days. 11 of them, for a civilization that had been doing first contact ceremonies for 11,000 years and had refined the protocols to the point that nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. Something unexpected had happened. Both parties withdrew from the chamber with perfect formal precision, the same precision they had entered with, because the form demanded it, and both parties honored the form even when everything beneath the form had just shifted. And I followed the human group down the preparation wing corridor and back toward the Corval Haas's docking connection without speaking, because nobody was speaking. And eventually I was back at the aft viewport I had stood at on the transit in, looking out at the hair of deep. And the Dreadnought was there in its position, and its running lights were burning steady, and it was not moving. Nobody said much in the preparation wing that evening. Ambassador Koval sat with her tea and her documents and her interior process. Commander Orant sent 2 messages from the communications suite, and then took a position near the forward sensor display, and monitored something I couldn't see on a screen angled away from me. Dr. Vorsen sat in a corner with his display and his stylus, and wrote at a pace I associated with people who have a great deal to say, and are trying to get it onto the page before the urgency fades. I stayed at the viewport. I thought about the Dreadnought, about the choice to put it there and what that choice involved. Not just the operational planning, the calculation of the sensor thresholds, the determination of the minimum emission configuration, the selection of the approach timing so that the ship's waking sequence would reach the ceremony chamber at exactly the right moment in the classification sequence. All of that was significant, But the thing I kept circling was something before the operational planning, the choice itself. Many people, in consultation, over a long period, had decided that the right thing to do at humanity's first formal first contact ceremony with the Cawdy consolidation was not to simply attend in good faith and hope for a favorable classification. Someone had decided that the ceremony was an opportunity, and that the opportunity was not to perform diplomacy at the Cawdy's level of expectation, but to establish, in the room, in the moment of formal assessment, a fact about humanity that no amount of trade register interaction and port fee negotiation and boundary station meetings had been able to establish. We had not been operating at the Cawdy's level of expectation. We had been operating below it, deliberately, for 11 years. Trading and transacting and presenting the understated face, and accumulating the read that said structural naivety and mid-tier biological species of localized relevance, and all the while, over those same 11 years, or before them, or both, building something that none of that face suggested was coming, and then placing that thing in the dark of the hair of deep, and waiting for the specific moment in the specific ceremony when it would mean the most. That was not naivety. That was not localized relevance. That was a patience that the Cawdy, with their 11,000-year architecture, were going to need to think about for 11 days. The Cawdy advance party remained aboard the Corval Haas for the duration of the suspension. They had their adapted quarters. They kept to them almost entirely, which the diplomatic staff noted was a departure from the advance party behavior protocols the Cawdy usually followed in suspension periods. Usually there were formal social calls, structured information exchanges, the low-temperature human contact that the Vekarimid used to maintain working relationships across gaps in formal process. None of that happened. The advance party ate their meals in their quarters, used the atmospheric systems, and were quiet. I ran into Sekarveth in a corridor on the third day. He was moving between his quarters and the environmental control node his team used for temperature management of their section, and I was coming from the observation deck, and we met at a T-junction and had approximately 10 seconds in the same corridor. He did not stop. He kept his pace. He did not use the formal assessment turn, but as he passed me, and I had time to notice this carefully because I was watching for exactly this kind of thing, because it was what Koval had asked me to watch for, he looked at me with both eyes. Not the dominant eye assessment, not the confrontation register that Drevath Call had used when the Dreadnought appeared, something between the two. Both eyes direct, but calibrated differently, a look that was not performing a protocol function but simply seeing. The way you look at something when you are not sure yet what category it belongs to, and you know you are not sure, and you are aware that your previous certainty about the category was incorrect, and you are in the process of gathering new data without yet knowing what question to direct it at. He walked past, I walked past, we did not speak. I wrote about it for 3 pages that night, and still wasn't satisfied with any of it. The resumed ceremony was scheduled for 8 days after the end of the suspension. It happened on schedule, because it was always going to happen on schedule. Whatever the Cawdy had been consulting about for 11 days, they had reached a result, and the result was going to be delivered. And on the morning of the appointed day, the Cawdy shuttle appeared at the Corval Haas's secondary bay, and the advance party stepped back through the adapted atmosphere door, and the ceremony began again from the suspension point. The quality of the room was different. I noticed it as soon as both parties were in the chamber. Before the ceremony resumed, before any formal phrase was exchanged, in the few seconds of mutual arrangement when both delegations were finding their positions, the air between them had a different texture than it had 11 days ago. Not hostility, not warmth. Density. Weight that had been accumulated during the suspension and was now present in the room, carried in the posture of both sides. And while both parties were honoring the form by proceeding as if the suspension had been a technical interruption and not a civilizational recalibration, Both parties knew what they were honoring the form around, and the form itself felt like a container for something heavier than before. Drevathkal stood where he had stood. His retinue stood where they had stood. His coloring was deep ready, the same sustained focus slate that he had carried throughout the first ceremony session. Ambassador Koval stood where she had stood. Commander Orant stood where she had stood. Dr. Vorson had his stylus ready. The ceremony resumed. The classification preamble was reread from the suspension point, both parties confirming they were proceeding on the basis of what had been established before the break. And then Drevathkal reached the point in the sequence where the classification itself was delivered. He spoke the designation. Makalu translated it, and then, for the first and only time during the entire ceremony, offered a structural gloss. Not a translation note, an explanation, because the designation had no direct counterpart in the human language taxonomy of Kaudi external classifications that the pre-mission analysis had compiled. Vethorant. It meant, Makalu explained later in full, something in the register of peer of the standing tier, a classification reserved for civilizations whose assessed standing could not be placed below the Vekari high administrative caste without producing a structural error in the hierarchical model. It was not equivalency. It was not Sovhid adjacent, the true peer designation that had been given twice in 11,000 years. But it carried relational protocols that normally accrued only after decades of accumulated formal interaction. Access tiers, consultation rights, direct communication channels that bypassed the Veth form trade register entirely. It was above anything the Kaudi had assigned a newly met species at first contact, ever. Dr. Vorson stopped breathing for a moment. I heard it, I was standing next to him. Ambassador Koval received the designation with the inclined head she had used on day one, and Drevathkal inclined his, and the ceremony proceeded through its closing sequence with the same formal precision that had carried every preceding phase. And when it ended, and both parties performed the mutual withdrawal, both parties did so in exact accordance with the agreed protocol, and nothing in the external execution indicated that anything unusual had occurred. But the designation was there. It was real. It had been spoken in a formal ceremony chamber, received and acknowledged by both parties, witnessed by 17 people. It had been produced by a civilization that had been classifying species for 11,000 years, and it had been produced by them in circumstances that were not what they had planned for when they arrived. They had planned to meet a mid-tier biological species of localized relevance, structurally naive about hierarchical position. They had planned to classify us as acknowledged and dealt with, subordinate but not dismissed, suitable for the working level of the administrative hierarchy. That was what the 11 years of data had suggested, and it was a reasonable conclusion from that data, and it was wrong, and the Dreadnought in the dark had made it wrong in a way that could not be argued with, because it was not an argument. On the transit back to Callisto, I spent a great deal of time at the Corval Haas's aft viewport. The Dreadnought was not visible. She had broken her position sometime during the suspension or shortly after the resumed ceremony, and gone wherever strategic assets go when they are no longer needed to be seen. The Hair of Deep had its stars and its dark and its distances, and I stood at the viewport and looked out at it and tried to settle what I had witnessed into something I could carry. Here is what I kept coming back to. The Dreadnought had not done anything. Not one act of aggression. Not one weapon brought to ready, not one transmission, not one maneuver that a tactical observer would read as hostile in any configuration. She had powered up, approached, and held position. 300 kilometers from the neutral station module, at no offensive range. And in that specific, calibrated nothing, in the precision of what she had not done, there was a message that was harder to process than any weapon signature, harder to argue with than any show of force. The message was not, "We will hurt you if you choose wrong." That message would have been simpler. The Kaudi understood that message. They had been receiving it from species for 11,000 years, and they had developed very refined protocols for processing it and responding to it from a position of strength. A direct threat was something they could work with. It gave them a category and a procedure. What the Dreadnought had communicated was not a threat. It was a demonstration of something prior to threat. Something the Kaudi, in processing 11 years of data about humanity, had not adequately weighted. We had built that ship. We had built it in secret, one of 4 in a classified program over years, while simultaneously conducting the trade register diplomacy and the boundary station meetings and the port access negotiations that constituted all the visible evidence about what humanity was. We had positioned it in the hair of deep, in the dark, weeks before the ceremony, and we had maintained it in an undetectable configuration for that entire period, which was not a short period, and which required significant operational discipline from a crew who had been sitting in the cold without active sensor arrays, and with minimal power draw, doing the hardest thing a military crew can be asked to do, which is nothing. We had timed its waking to arrive at exactly the right moment in the classification sequence. Not during the opening protocols, not during the formal establishment of mutual recognition, but during the classification itself, when the question of what humanity was had been formally posed, and the answer was in the process of being produced. And we had done all of this not to threaten, not to coerce, not to extract a favorable classification through implicit intimidation, but to provide the Kaudi's classification system with accurate data to work from. The previous 11 years of data had been incomplete. The Dreadnought completed it. The Kaudi were a precision instrument. Precision instruments produce accurate outputs when they are given accurate inputs. We had given them an incomplete input set for 11 years. The Dreadnought was the correction. That was the patience, not the patience of waiting. The patience of constructing a complete picture over time, across years in pieces, without revealing the pattern before the pattern was ready to be received. The patience of knowing what you are building and not rushing the reveal, because the moment of reveal matters, and the right moment only comes once. The Kaudi had been doing first contact ceremonies for 11,000 years. They had a framework for species that were not fully what they seemed, species that revealed more capability than anticipated, species that arrived with more preparation than expected. They had seen variations on this scenario before, in various registers and at various scales. They had not, in the available record, encountered a species that had understood the framework well enough to use the framework's own most significant moment as the delivery mechanism for the revision. That understanding, I thought, standing at the viewport with the hair of deep behind me, that was the thing that had taken 11 days. Not the Dreadnought itself, not its size or its capability envelope or what it implied about our industrial output. Those were numbers that could be processed quickly. What had taken 11 days was the reckoning with what the choice to deploy it in that way at that moment implied about who had made the choice. You need to understand something to use it. You need to have looked at the Kaudi classification ceremony with the clear-eyed attention of people who had studied it carefully enough to know which moment was the right moment for a revision of this magnitude. And then you need to have held that knowledge for long enough to build the instrument that would deliver the revision. And then you need to have trusted the entire sequence to hold across the deployment, across the transit, across the days of sitting cold and silent in the dark, across the ceremony itself, and through the moment of reveal. That was not naivety about hierarchical station. That was a different kind of knowledge entirely. I have been back to boundary station work since then. Different postings, similar rooms. Cold and dry, the thermoregulation architecture on the walls, the blue-shifted light. I have dealt with Kaudi administrators at the Veth-form trade register the same as before, the same wrist-press greetings, the same lateral assessment turns, the same paperwork, the same port access schedules, the same transit tariff codes, the same professional remove. Most of it is unchanged in its externals. But there is one thing that is different, and I notice it every time I am in a room with a Caudy administrator. When they look at me, just look, the ordinary non-formal gaze, not the assessment turn, and not the confrontation register, but the everyday look of someone briefly acknowledging a person in their vicinity. There is a quality in it now that was not there before the hair of deep ceremony. It is not fear. I want to be precise about that, because fear would be the simple reading and it would be wrong. The Caudy do not process external species interactions in a fear register. It is not respect in the simple social sense, either. It is something more calibrated, something that a precision instrument shows when it has updated its reference standard and is not yet fully confident that it has correctly characterized the implications of the update. An active quality. Something still working. Assessment. Genuine assessment, ongoing, of a subject that has proved to require more precision than the previous methodology provided for. They are still running the calculation. I can see it sometimes in a room in the quality of a look that lasts 2 seconds rather than 1. They are still building the model. They took 11 days in the hair of deep, and they have been working since, and they are precise instruments doing what precise instruments do with a problem that resists easy resolution. I think about that sometimes. Driving back to my station, standing at whatever cold viewport the posting provides, looking out at whatever stars are available. They are still working on it. So are we.